This philosophical journey dissolves the quest for self-love into the realization that you are the universe itself. How to build unbreakable self-love. A journey inspired by Carl Jung. In a world that incessantly invites us to look outward for validation, the most crucial and paradoxically, the most neglected journey is the one that leads us inward. To build unbreakable self-love is not an act of selfishness, but an imperative of the soul, a foundation upon which an authentic and fulfilling life can be erected. Inspired by the profound wisdom of the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, we will embark on a detailed and multifaceted exploration of this process, unveiling the paths that lead not to a fragile self-esteem dependent on circumstances, but to a self-love that resembles an inner fortress, resilient and impenetrable. The Jungian perspective on self-love radically departs from superficial notions of positive self-affirmation. For Jung, self-love is not something one acquires like a material possession, but something that is unveiled through a continuous and at times arduous process of self-knowledge. This process, which he termed individuation, is the life journey of becoming the person we truly are in our totality by integrating all aspects of our psyche, both the luminous and the shadowy. Modern society, with its emphasis on perfection and external success, often teaches us to repress or deny parts of ourselves we deem unacceptable. We create a persona, a socially acceptable mask we present to the world. This persona, while necessary for social interaction, can become a gilded cage if we over-identify with it, forgetting who we are behind the facade. The first step toward authentic self-love is, therefore, the recognition and relativization of this persona. Beneath the surface of our consciousness, in the vast and mysterious territory of the unconscious, resides our shadow. The shadow, one of Jung's most fascinating concepts, is not inherently evil. It is simply the repository of everything we have repressed. Our fears, our insecurities, our inconvenient desires, our undeveloped talents, in short, everything that does not fit the idealized image we have of ourselves, ought to ignore. The shadow is a grave error in the quest for self-love. The more we deny it, the denser and more powerful it becomes, projecting itself onto others in the form of judgments, criticisms, and prejudices. We see in others the flaws we cannot admit in ourselves. The work with the shadow, or shadow work, is therefore a fundamental pillar of the Jungian journey. This work requires immense courage. It means looking into the mirror of the soul and confronting the parts of ourselves we would rather not see. It demands a brutal honesty with oneself, a willingness to admit, yes, I am also capable of this. I also feel envy. I also have dark thoughts. It is a process that humbles and humanizes us, shattering the illusion of our own perfection. The integration of the shadow does not mean giving in to our most primitive impulses, but rather bringing them into the light of consciousness. By recognizing and accepting our capacity for anger, for example, we can learn to channel that energy constructively, instead of allowing it to control us or manifest in a destructive and unconscious manner. Self-love flourishes in this soil of unconditional acceptance. Another crucial element in the architecture of the Jungian psyche are the archetypes of the anima and animus. The anima represents the inner feminine in a man, while the animus represents the inner masculine in a woman. These archetypes embody the qualities of the opposite gender that we carry in our unconscious. A man who does not integrate his anima may become excessively rigid, logical, and disconnected from his emotions and creativity. A woman who does not integrate her animus may feel passive, lacking assertiveness, and unable to express her opinions with firmness. The projection of these archetypes onto romantic partners is a common source of conflict and disillusionment, developing A conscious relationship with our inner anima or animus is a profound act of self-love. For a man, it means cultivating sensitivity, intuition, and the capacity to relate. For a woman, it means developing courage, logic, and the ability to act in the world with purpose. This integration makes us more complete, more balanced, and less dependent on external validation to feel whole. The journey of individuation is, in its essence, a journey toward wholeness. It is not about achieving perfection, but about embracing our humanity in all its complexity and contradiction. Unbreakable self-love is born from the understanding that we are a microcosm of the universe, containing within us the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine, the hero and the villain. This process is often catalyzed by moments of crisis, loss, or deep suffering. It is in the dark of the dark night of the soul that we are forced to abandon our old identities and seek a deeper truth about ourselves. It is in these moments that the shell of our ego cracks, allowing the light of our soul, our self, to begin to shine. The self, for Jung, is the central archetype of wholeness and order. It is the organizing center of the psyche, our inner divine core. The goal of individuation is to establish a conscious axis between the ego and the self. When this happens, the ego ceases to be the tyrannical master of our life and becomes the loyal servant of the self. The self-love that emanates from the self is unlike anything we know. It is not an inflated pride or disguised arrogance. It is a calm and deep sense of belonging, acceptance, and inner peace. It is the silent recognition of our own worth, independent of our achievements or failures. This self-love manifests in concrete actions. We begin to set healthy boundaries in our relationships, not out of anger or resentment, but out of a deep respect for ourselves. We stop seeking the approval of others, for we find within ourselves the only validation that truly matters. We learn to forgive ourselves for our past mistakes, understanding that they were an integral part of our learning journey. We cultivate self-compassion, treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding we would offer a dear friend who is suffering. The practice of mindfulness and self-observation becomes an indispensable tool on this path. By observing our thoughts and emotions without judgment, we create a space between stimulus and reaction, allowing us to choose more conscious responses aligned with ourself. Dreams also play a fundamental role in the Jungian perspective. They are direct messages from our unconscious, offering us symbols and insights that can guide us on a journey of individuation. Learning the symbolic language of our dreams is like having a map to the treasure hidden in our own soul. Creativity, in all its forms, is another pathway to the self. Whether through painting, writing, music, or dance, creative expression allows us to give form to the contents of our unconscious, integrating them in a playful and transformative way. Unbreakable self-love is not a final destination, but a continuous dance between consciousness and the unconscious, between the ego and the self. It is a daily commitment to show up for ourselves with honesty, courage, and compassion. It is the courage to be imperfect, the strength to be vulnerable, the wisdom to know that we are enough, exactly as we are. By embracing our shadow, we integrate our totality. By connecting with our anima or animus, we find inner balance. By surrendering to the wisdom of ourself, we discover a love that cannot be broken, for it depends on nothing outside of us. This is the legacy of Carl Jung, an invitation to the grandest of all adventures, the journey back home to the heart of ourselves. A journey that transforms us from the inside out, allowing us to live with more authenticity, purpose, and above all, with a self-love that is truly unbreakable. The journey, however, never truly ends. Each new stage of life brings with it new challenges and new opportunities for a deepening of individuation. The integration of the shadow is a continuous work, and the relationship with the self requires constant nourishment. What else could be discovered in the depths of the psyche? What other archetypes await to be recognized and integrated? What new facets of our being yearn to come to light? The path unfolds with each step, and the invitation to continue the exploration always remains open. The exploration, in fact, never ceases, for the psyche is not a static land to be mapped once and for all, but a living, pulsating, and constantly moving ocean. The first great achievement, that of confronting the persona and initiating dialogue with the shadow, is like learning to navigate. It establishes the courage and fundamental skills. But there are deeper currents, older archetypal creatures, and undiscovered islands of consciousness that await the intrepid traveler. Once we begin to integrate our shadow and dialogue with our anima or animus, a new archetypal figure tends to emerge from the depths. It is the figure of the wise old man or the wise old woman, the archetype of the Senex or Sophia. This is not an external guide, but an inner source of wisdom, a personification of the self that speaks with a voice of clarity, meaning, and purpose. To develop self-love in this deeper phase means learning to listen to and trust this voice above all others. The voice of the inner wise sage does not shout. It whispers. It manifests through sudden intuitions, deep insights during moments of stillness, or in dreams that carry an unmistakable weight of meaning. To love oneself, here, is the act of cultivating the silence necessary to hear this whisper, honoring one's own innate wisdom instead of endlessly searching for gurus or external validation for one's deepest truths. However, on the path to the wisdom of the Senex, we often encounter another powerful and seductive archetype, the pure eternus or the pola eterna, the eternal youth or the eternal maiden. This is the part of us that refuses to grow up, that yearns for unrestricted freedom, that lives in the world of infinite potential, but fears commitment and embodiment in the real, limited world. It is the Peter Pan within us, who flies high in fantasies but is terrified of landing and living a human life, with its responsibilities and inevitable disappointments. Unbreakable self-love demands that we confront this inner, eternal youth, not with rejection, but with parental compassion. It means recognizing its yearning for wonder and spontaneity, but also helping it understand that true magic happens when potential is manifested in the concrete. To love this part of yourself is to give it roots, teaching it that commitment to a path, a relationship, or a job is not a prison, but the fertile ground where the soul can truly flourish. As we navigate between the wisdom of the wise sage and the whims of the eternal youth, the self begins to communicate in an even more mysterious and direct way, through synchronicity. Jung defined synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence, an event in the outer world that causally mirrors an inner state. It's the book that falls from the shelf open to the exact page that answers your question. It's the unexpected encounter with a person who becomes crucial to your development, right after a dream about them. To observe and honor synchronicities is a profound act of self-love, for it is a recognition that we are not alone or adrift in a chaotic universe. It is the confirmation that there is a greater intelligence, the self, weaving our life with a thread of meaning. To trust these signs, even when logic fails to comprehend them, is to surrender to a wisdom that transcends the ego, strengthening faith in one's own journey. This path inevitably leads to the experience of the numinous. The numinous is the direct, overwhelming, and transformative encounter with the sacred, with the divine mystery. It is a moment of awe and wonder that shatters the barriers of the ego and connects us to something infinitely greater than ourselves. It can happen in the contemplation of a starry night, in the depth of a work of art, or in the silence of deep meditation. These numinous experiences are the most solid foundation of unbreakable self-love. Once you have directly experienced your connection to the whole, your intrinsically sacred nature, the need for external validation drastically diminishes. The opinions of others, worldly failures, criticisms, all of this loses its power in the face of the experiential certainty of your own soul. Self-love ceases to be a mental construct and becomes a state of being, anchored in the very experience of the divine. This journey, however, can be lonely. By differentiating from the mentality of the persona and the collective consciousness, the individual may feel like a stranger, a misfit. Self-love, in this phase, involves the ability to endure this loneliness without despair, understanding it not as isolation, but as a sacred space for communion with the self. It is a self-love that learns to differentiate between loneliness and being alone. One learns to value one's own company as a sanctuary. And, paradoxically, it is from this capacity to be truly alone that it becomes possible to create authentic and deep relationships with others, based not on neediness or lack, but on the mutual sharing of two totalities. The journey also descends in the matter, into flesh and bone. Jungian self-love must ultimately embrace the reality of the body and of aging. In a culture that idolizes youth, to love oneself means to love the body in all its phases, its changes, its scars, its inevitable decline. It is finding beauty in impermanence and wisdom in the marks left by time. It is a love that does not identify with the image in the mirror, but that honors the body as the faithful and precious vehicle of the soul on this earthly journey. Caring for it becomes not an act of vanity, but of gratitude. Accepting its limitations is not resignation, but a profound act of humility and realism which frees an immense amount of psychic energy. Finally, the integration of all these elements culminates in what the Stoic philosophers called amor fati, the love of one's fate. This is perhaps the apex of unbreakable self-love. It is the ability to look back at the totality of your life, with all its joys and pains, successes and most bitter mistakes, the light and the densest shadow, and to say a resounding yes to it all. It is understanding that every event, every person, every challenge was a necessary thread in the unique tapestry of your individuation. There is nothing to regret, for everything served the purpose of bringing you to the present moment, to the person you have become. This level of radical acceptance is the ultimate freedom. It is a love that not only forgives, but blesses the entirety of one's own existence. Still, even this universal yes is not an endpoint. The psyche, being a reflection of the infinite, continues to unfold. The individual who has achieved such a profound degree of love and self-integration begins to realize that their personal journey has transpersonal implications. Their individual healing becomes a small but significant contribution to the healing of the collective unconscious. The journey that began as a search for self-worth can, in its most advanced stages, transform into something entirely new, a path of conscious service, born not from a moral duty, but from a heart that has recognized itself in everything and everyone. This overflowing of the heart is, in itself, the final and most sublime phase of individuation. Self-love, once solidified on the bedrock of self-awareness and recognition of the self, ceases to be a construction project and becomes a natural spring that, once discovered, can no longer be contained and flows naturally to nourish the land around it. The question ceases to be, how can I love myself? And transforms into, how can this love that I am express itself in the world? This new orientation is not born from a moral imperative or a should imposed by society or religion. The service that emanates from the self is not a reluctant sacrifice of the ego. It is the joyful expression of the soul that has found its place in the whole. It is the tree that upon reaching maturity offers its fruit not out of obligation, but because bearing fruit is its innermost nature. Generosity becomes a reflex, not an effort. At this stage, The individual fully embodies the archetype of the wounded healer. The very wounds that were the focus of the inner work, the inadequacies, the traumas, the encounters with the shadow become the source of a deep and authentic empathy. The one who has journeyed to the depths of their own personal hell is the only one who can guide others through the dark with a genuine light, not with the arrogance of perfection, but with the compassion born of shared experience. Unbreakable self-love, therefore, does not isolate us in an ivory tower of self-sufficiency. On the contrary, it makes us porous to the suffering of the world, but in a new way. We are no longer crushed by it, because our center, the ego self-axis, remains firm. Instead, we become capable of containing and metabolizing a part of that suffering, transforming it into understanding and conscious action, just as we did with our own pain. This conscious action goes beyond the interpersonal. It touches the domain of the collective unconscious. Jung posited that we all share a psychic reservoir of inherited memories and archetypes. The great shadows of humanity, our propensity for violence, prejudice, greed, environmental destruction, reside in this collective space. The individual, who integrates their personal shadow, withdraws a small portion of energy from the collective shadow. By choosing consciousness over blind reaction, by choosing integration over projection, the individuated person performs an act of cosmic significance. Their life becomes a microcosm of the great work, magnum opus, of the alchemists, the transformation of the lead of collective unconsciousness into the gold of awakened consciousness. Their service to the world lies not only in what they do, but in what they are. Their very existence becomes a point of light. In the vast network of the human psyche, the journey of self-love can be seen through this alchemical lens. The initial phase of confronting pain and shadow is the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution into primordial chaos. The phase of purification, of dream analysis, differentiation, and understanding is the albedo, the whitening. And the overflowing of love into compassionate service is the rubedo, the reddening, the final union of opposites, the synthesis of spirit and matter, the creation of the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone, in this context, is not a magical object that turns metals into literal gold. It is the realized self itself, the integrated consciousness that has the power to heal, to transmute suffering into wisdom, and to radiate a love that is at once personal and universal. The possession of this stone does not lead to hoarding, but to giving. This conscious service manifests in countless ways, many of them silent and invisible to the outside world. It may be the parent who, having healed their own wounds with their parents, raises a child free from transgenerational neurotic burdens. It may be the artist whose work resonates with archetypal truths, offering nourishment to the souls of thousands. It may be the leader who makes decisions from a place of wholeness, considering human and ecological well-being above short-term profit. It may simply be the presence of an individual who does not panic in the midst of chaos, who listens without judgment, who radiates a peace that calms the anxiety in others. The greatest service, often, is not doing, but being. The quality of a person's consciousness is their greatest contribution to the world. It is a beacon that merely by being lit allows other ships to navigate more safely in the darkness that we arrive. Then, at the final and most beautiful paradox, the journey that began with an intense focus on the I, on building an unbreakable self-love culminates in the dissolution of that very I into something much larger. The ego, now a faithful and humble servant, realizes that self-love and love for the other are ultimately indistinguishable. They are facets of the one and only reality. Love as the fundamental force of the cosmos. Love becomes impersonal in the best sense of the word. It is not cold or distant, but rather universal, extending to everything and everyone unconditionally. For the self recognizes itself in all forms. The fortress of self-love no longer exists to protect a separate I, but has become an open temple, a place of refuge and radiance for life itself. The question that emerges from this state is no longer about what to do or how to be, but rather about how to participate more fully in the continuous dance of creation. The individual becomes a conscious co-creator with the universe, a channel through which the self can experience and express itself in a unique and irreplaceable way. The journey of self-love reveals itself as the universe itself becoming conscious of itself through us. And this process, this infinite unfolding of consciousness and love, is the only true immortality we are offered, and this unfolding, this participation in the cosmic dance, transcends psychology itself and enters the territory of the mystical. The language of archetypes, which once served as a map to navigate the inner terrain, now becomes the very script of the lived life. The individual is no longer just working with archetypes. They become a conscious channel for them, a vehicle for these universal energies to manifest in a balanced and creative way in the world. The archetype of the king or queen, for example, ceases to be an ego fantasy of power and manifests as a serene and natural ability to order one's own inner kingdom and to generate order and fertility in the surrounding environment. It is the ability to assume full sovereignty over one's own life, not with authoritarianism, but with the wisdom, justice, and compassion born from the integration of the self. The kingdom they govern may be a family, a company, a community, or simply the garden of their own existence. Likewise, the archetype of the magician or the priestess manifests not as the practice of tricks or rituals to manipulate reality for personal gain, but as the deep understanding that consciousness affects reality. The spell of the individuated individual is their focused intention, their word aligned with truth, their ability to see the invisible potential in situations and to act in a way that brings it into existence. It is the magic of transforming a difficult conversation into an act of healing, or of seeing a crisis not as a disaster, but as an opportunity for transformation. Conscious service, seen from this perspective, becomes the very art of living. Distinction between the sacred and the profane disappears. Washing the dishes, preparing a meal, filling out a spreadsheet, comforting a friend. Every act, when performed from this center of integrated love and consciousness, becomes a moving meditation, an act of co-creation. Ordinary life reveals itself as the main stage where the extraordinary manifests. At this stage, the relationship with time also undergoes a radical transformation. The tyranny of Chronos linear, quantitative time, which marches relentlessly toward death and generates anxiety, gives way to the experience of Kairos. Kairos is qualitative time, the opportune moment, the eternal now that is replete with meaning and potential. Life ceases to be a race against the clock and becomes a succession of present moments, each complete in itself. The fear of physical death profoundly diminishes, as the primary identity no longer resides in the transient ego or the mortal body. Consciousness, having recognized itself as an aspect of the eternal and universal self, understands that death is merely a transition, the dissolution of one form so that energy can assume another. Self-love becomes love for the soul's own journey through countless forms. A yes, not only to this life, but to the eternal cycle of being, becoming, dissolving, and being reborn. This acceptance does not lead to passivity, but to a form of fearless and joyful action. When one does not fear the final outcome, one can participate in the game of life with total surrender, creativity, and lightness. Success or failure, in the world's terms, lose their crushing weight. What matters is the quality of participation, the authenticity of expression, the integrity of the act. Unbreakable self-love reveals itself in its final manifestation as a serene and unconditional joy of existing. It is the joy of the mountain in being a mountain, the joy of the river in flowing to the sea. It is not a euphoric, fleeting happiness dependent on external circumstances, but a deep and constant resonance with the very truth of being. The universe, which once seemed an indifferent or even hostile place, is now perceived as an intelligent, playful, and loving dance partner. And the dance itself is the goal. There is no final destination to be reached, for the arrival point is contained in every step of the way. The journey of self-love does not lead us to a static state of perfection, but frees us to participate fully with our entire being in the endless and glorious mystery of creation. Thus, the individual who set out in search of themselves finds the cosmos. And in finding the cosmos, they realize that their own consciousness is the instrument through which the universe sings itself. The question that remains, then, is no longer personal, but musical. What is the melody that only this soul, in this exact time and place, can bring to the world to enrich the symphony of the whole? And how can we learn to listen to this inner melody with ever-increasing clarity, moment by moment? To learn to listen to this inner melody is the spiritual and psychological practice of maturity. Clarity comes not from mental effort, but from a progressive silencing. It is the art of turning down the volume of the ego's incessant noise, its ambitions, its fears, its self-imposed narratives, and the internalized opinions of others, so that a more subtle and fundamental vibration can be perceived. This listening is not a passive act. It is an active receptivity. It happens when we are present in the body, feeling the visceral responses that life provokes in us. It happens in the attention to patterns of synchronicity, which act as the baton of the self's conductor, indicating the rhythm and direction. It happens in the ruthless honesty with our own feelings, which are the raw notes that make up the melody. Clarity increases, moment by moment, through a continuous commitment to authenticity. Each time we choose an action, a word, or a thought that resonates with this inner truth, instead of one that serves to please, impress, or protect us, the signal becomes stronger and the noise weaker. It is a process of tuning, like turning the dial of an old radio, passing through hiss and static until we find the crystal clear frequency of our own soul. This unique melody is what Jung would call our personal myth. Each of us is born with an innate myth, an archetypal story that our soul yearns to live out. For one, it may be the myth of the warrior who fights for justice. For another, the myth of the lover who unites what is separate. For a third, the myth of the hermit who seeks wisdom and solitude to then share it. Self-love, in its highest expression, is the courage to discover and live this personal myth. Regardless of how grand or humble it may seem in the eyes of the world, to live this myth does not mean to stage a drama. It means that the fabric of our life, our career choices, our relationships, our hobbies, becomes the natural and coherent expression of this central story. The person stops trying to be something they are not and relaxes into what they have always been. There's a sense of homecoming, of alignment, where energy flows effortlessly because it is no longer spent maintaining a facade or fighting against one's own nature. For this melody to be played, it needs an instrument. The instrument is our personality, our ego, which has gone through the entire process of individuation. All the work with the shadow, the integration of the anima animus, and the relativization of the persona was the artisanal process of crafting, sanding, and tuning. This instrument, an ego that was once the arrogant musician, playing its own songs of self-importance out of tune, now becomes the Stradivarius violin, perfectly built and tuned, that joyfully surrenders to the hands of the true musician, the self. This tuned instrument does not fear the low notes of sadness, nor does it inflate with the high notes of joy. It simply resonates with the truth of each moment, capable of playing the entire range of human experience with clarity, depth, and resonance. The personality is not annihilated, but perfected to become the perfect vehicle for the spirit. And no melody is played in a vacuum. It is played in the context of an orchestra, the world, and other people. The individual learns to play their song in harmony with others. They develop a sensitivity to know when their melody blends beautifully with another's, creating a rich and complex harmony, and when it creates unbearable dissonance. Relationships come to be chosen based on this musical resonance, and boundaries are set not as walls, but as the necessary silence between the notes, which gives shape and beauty to the music. Furthermore, life rarely follows a fixed score. The ability to improvise becomes essential. Here, the archetype of the trickster, now integrated, offers its gift. It brings flexibility, humor, and the ability to find a new and creative harmony when a wrong note is played, or when the music takes an unexpected turn. It prevents the spiritual journey from becoming solemn, dogmatic, or rigid, keeping the dance alive, spontaneous, and full of grace. In the end, the deepest listening reveals that the melody emerges not from sound, but from silence. Behind all the music of existence, there is a primordial silence, a fertile void of pure potential. The ultimate practice becomes the ability to rest in this silence, to return to this source. It is in this silence that the instrument is retuned and that the next musical phrase is received. Always new, always fresh. The journey of unbreakable self-love, which began as a search for a solid center within a separate self, is completed in the discovery that the true self is this conscious silence itself. A silence that is not empty, but full. A silence from which the entire symphony of the universe is born, moment by moment. The individual no longer seeks to be loved, nor strives to love themselves. They simply rest in their being, which is love itself, manifesting as a unique and irreplaceable note in the infinite song of existence. And in this song, in this repose in being, the very nature of experience is altered. The figure of the seeker, the pilgrim who journeyed in search of themselves, dissolves like the morning mist in the sun. The effort ceases. The inner struggle, which was the engine of much of the journey, simply vanishes, not through repression or denial, but for lack of a separate I to sustain it. Life continues with its joys and its challenges, but it is no longer lived by an I that manages it, controls it, and worries about it. Instead, there is the sense of being lived by life, of being danced by the dance. Actions arise not from the ego's anxious deliberation, but from a spontaneous and appropriate response that springs from the inner silence. This is what the Taoist sages called Wu Wei, effortless action, doing without a doer. It is participation in the divine play, the lila, with the likeness of a child who fully trusts the flow of the game. The perception of the outer world undergoes a silent revolution. The world ceases to be a stage of others and things and reveals itself as a multifaceted mirror of the self. To look into another's face is to find a reflection of oneself. To feel the breeze on the skin is the universe's caress of itself. The world's pain is no longer an external tragedy to be lamented, but a contraction felt in the very heart of existence, which calls not for pity, but for presence and consciousness. The boundary between inner and outer becomes hopelessly porous until the very distinction loses its meaning. The planet's ecology and the body's physiology are perceived as a single interconnected system. Compassion ceases to be a virtue to be cultivated and becomes the factual recognition of non-separation. One cannot hurt another without hurting oneself, not because it is a moral rule, but because it is an ontological impossibility. The body, the faithful companion of the entire journey, is finally honored in its fullness. It is no longer a mere vehicle, an instrument, or a burden. It becomes the sacred altar, the exact point in space-time where the infinite touches the finite, where universal consciousness experiences itself in form. Each breath is a prayer. Each heartbeat is the rhythm of the cosmic drum. Each sensation is an act of direct communion with reality. To live in this body becomes a practice of devotion. To nourish it, to move it, to allow it to rest, all of this becomes part of the art of living, an act of honor to the mystery of incarnation. Aging and death lose their sting of terror, for they are seen as natural and sacred processes of the altar itself, the transformation of form that allows consciousness to continue its infinite journey. The concept of legacy also transforms. The need to leave a mark, to build monuments, or to be remembered by name fades away. The true legacy of a being who has reached this state is not material. It is vibrational. It is the resonance of their unique note that has been added to the symphony. It is the quality of consciousness they have anchored on earth. It is a clearing of peace they have opened in the dense forest of collective unconsciousness, a space that remains and makes the journey a little easier for those who come after. Greatest contribution is the silent transmission of their state of being. It is a peace that can be felt, a freedom that can be inspiring, a joy that can be contagious. All of this often without the need for a single word. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of shared consciousness. And finally, the journey through the immense complexity of the psyche, with its archetypes, shadows, and symbols, flows into a radical simplicity. The maps that were so crucial for navigating the territory are now gently set aside. They are no longer needed, for the traveler has arrived home, and home is here and now, in every ordinary moment. The great secret revealed at the end of the path is that the treasure was always in the simplicity of the present. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The difference is not in the act, but in the consciousness with which the act is performed. Chopping wood becomes the dance of form and emptiness. Carrying water becomes the flowing of existence itself. Unbreakable self-love has found its final expression, the dissolution of the very self that needed to be loved into a peace that simply is. A peace that permeates every atom, every thought, every moment. It is not a static end, but the beginning of a life lived in harmony with the pulse of the real. It is the silent miracle of existence, unfolding, breathing through us, now and forever. The final ending, and here, in the silence that follows the last note of the symphony, when the dance seems to have reached its end, the narrative folds back on itself to reveal its final surprise, its deepest and most liberating secret. This entire epic journey, this detailed and moving quest for an unbreakable self-love, began from a fundamental premise that there existed a separate, fragile, and incomplete I that needed to build, deserve, or discover love. We wrestled with the persona, confronted the shadow, integrated the opposites, journeyed through archetypes, and opened ourselves to the self, all in the name of healing and loving this I. The final revelation, the cosmic joke that echoes in the heart of the silence, is this: that I never existed, not as a real separate entity. It was the first archetype, the primary illusion, the central character in the dream that the universe was dreaming through us. It was the necessary point, a view for the journey to begin, the knot of contraction in consciousness that created the drama of the search. The entire path was not a process of construction, but of dismantlement. The confrontation with the shadow was not to improve the ego, but to shatter its presumption of goodness and control, revealing its arbitrariness. The integration of the anima and animus was not to make the ego more complete, but to dissolve its rigid identity into a universal, androgynous totality. The encounter with the self was not the ego's greatest achievement, but its final act of unconditional surrender. It's joyful, dissolution into the ocean from which it had emerged as a solitary wave. The quest for self-love was the sacred ruse that life itself used to seduce us into dismantling the illusion of separation. We were led to polish the mirror of our being, not so that our reflection would become perfect, but so that the mirror would become so clean and transparent that it would disappear, revealing only the reality it had always reflected. What then remains when the seeker and the self to be loved are revealed as two sides of the same mirage? Only love remains, not the love of a subject for an object, not a self-love, just love as the fabric of the real, as the substance of every atom and the light in every gaze. The universe, through our eyes, finally freed from the cataract of the eye, recognizes itself in everything. The love for a tree, a child, a stone, or an enemy becomes indistinguishable. For all our manifestations of the one and only consciousness that looks, that loves, and that is, the unbreakable fortress we spent a lifetime building was not to protect an eye, but to reveal itself as the open, infinite space of existence itself, where everything is already welcomed, where everything already belongs. Thus, the great philosophical journey into oneself finds its surprising end by revealing itself not as a line leading to a treasure, but as a circle returning to the starting point. However, this starting point, the simple fact of being alive, here and now, is seen for the first time with awakened eyes, and in this vision, all the glory of the universe is revealed in the most ordinary of moments. Love was not the destination to be reached. Love was the origin, the path, and the traveler. And, in the end, there was no one left to search for it.